Hello, everyone. My name is Meg Bruner, and I am guest webinar hosting today while your regular host, Dr. Bia Carlini, is out. I'm very excited to welcome you to this month's Northwest ATTC webinar, Teens Are Us and the SBIRT Model. And before we get started, I have just a couple of notes for you. Let's see, moving the slide. Maybe, there we go. Okay, first, the slides from today's webinar will be coming to you in an email this afternoon, along with a link to a survey about the webinar that we would love for you to fill out for us. In fact, we would love it so much if you filled it out for us that if you complete and submit that survey, you'll get a $5 gift card to Starbucks or Amazon. You get to pick. And we'll also be sending you a second survey in 30 days that has the same bonus. So that's 2 lattes on us, which is a great deal. Second, a recording of this webinar is being made and will be up on our website early next week. And then finally, if this is your first webinar with us, we use the chat box function in Zoom for questions. And you can type a question into chat anytime during the webinar. And then at the end, I'll be reading as many of those as we have time for to Dr. Winters to get his answers for you. So let's get started. Dr. Ken Winters is a senior scientist at the Oregon Research Institute and adjunct faculty at the University of Minnesota Department of Psychology. His primary research interests include the assessment and treatment of adolescent drug abuse. Dr. Winters is on the editorial boards of several prominent journals in the field and has received numerous grants from NIH and various foundations over the years. He's published over 125 peer-reviewed articles, which is incredible. And over the past 10 years, he's been researching brief interventions and the SBIRT model. So welcome to the webinar, Dr. Winters. I'm gonna transfer control over to you in just a sec. We'll see if we can get this to work.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Meg, and hello, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity. Also, a thanks to Bia for helping make this happen. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm not going to try to take all the time by talking. I want to leave some time for Q&A. And also feel free to email me. You see my email there if you have a follow-up question that can't be addressed today. So some of you, I assume, know what SBIRT is. This has been around for a while. It's getting more popular with teenagers, I'd make a case. And the model isn't, at least its components aren't new. People have screened and done brief interventions and figured out how to refer teenagers for more treatment for decades, but this has been put into an interesting model and formalized over the last few years. So let's get a disclosure for you. I do have a personal commercial interest with one of the brief intervention programs that will briefly be noted as background material. And I have a personal disclosure. I'm hoping that actually this is not your reaction or part of your evaluation of the talk when it's done. I'm borrowing from the famous physicist Enrico Fermi when he said, or heard from a participant, "Before I came here, I was confused about this subject. Having listened to your lecture, I am still confused, but on a higher level." I'm hoping I don't bloviate so much and get too confusing that you have that reaction afterwards. Before we get into the SBIRT model, a couple thoughts on when counseling any teenager who might have a substance abuse problem. And I'm being a little simplistic here, but I think there's plenty of interesting research over decades that have made a case that the stronger your therapeutic alliance with the teenager, the more likely you are to have great outcomes. And as people have looked inside, what does it mean to have therapeutic alliance? You know, how well you connect with a teenager looks like has a lot to do with that client, that teenager seeing you as a credible person and someone who is using a credible and a meaningful or believable strategy or approach. It's one reason why I like SBIRT models, because I think they're very teen friendly. And then another feature that's important when we're working with teenagers who have a problem with substance use is the key to try to help him or her understand what the functional value of that use may be and how you can help him or her figure out a way to break those connections. You'll see how SBIRT tries to do that quite soon. Then there's another feature, the having to understand the dynamics of motivation. I think that's important in counseling. And motivation is a complex term, and it reflects, more than one direction. So on one hand, we can talk about you as a therapist being a motivator. You're trying to convince a person to recognize they may have a problem, or recognize they may need to change their behaviors, and you want to help him or her steer their life down a healthier path. And so to some degree, as a counselor, you want to be an excellent or a great motivator. So I thought I'd just bring up a couple examples. I'm a sports fan, so I found two examples of so-called great motivators from the sports world. And the first one I picked is Vince Lombardi. He's quite famous, as you may know, for being able to bring many teams, football teams, to great success. He's known for a lot of great quotes. One of them is, "Confidence is contagious, so is lack of confidence." And to some degree, you're trying to build confidence in your client and make that a contagious part of their personality, a part of their motivation to change. Someone with a very different path towards being a great motivator is Jill Costello. Probably no one has heard of her. She was highlighted in a Sports Illustrated article back in 2010. She was the caller of the elite championship rowing team at the University of California. So she wasn't a rower, but she was the key person in the rowing boat that motivated all the others. And the article spent a lot of time talking about how special she was, how she used unique features to motivate, and how her personality just exuded motivation among her teammates, and how she struggled with a chronic illness, didn't let that get in the way of her working as a wonderful teammate. Now, motivation also is something we have to understand from the perspective of our client. And when we're dealing with individuals that have a substance use problem, to some degree, we are having to deal with triggers and cravings and motivate that person to not let those triggers and cravings influence their behavior. And psychologists have talked about this phenomenon with many constructs. One of them is self-control. And you may know about the so-called marshmallow test that is a way to look at how well somebody can handle self-control. I thought I would show you this very brief YouTube video that shows how children are trying to handle the temptation of resisting a marshmallow and having to exert self-control. Let's see if this pops up for you. So are we getting volume, Meg?
Yep.
Oh, good. There we go. Yeah, no volume from me, Meg, either.
I hear it fine. It may be that it's not going to transfer over via Zoom, so we may have to just describe the video.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. So throughout this video, these youngsters are trying to resist. The challenge is they're told to not eat the marshmallow. And in about 2 or 3 minutes, the adult will come back. And if they haven't eaten it, they'll get a second one. And then the adult leaves the room and they don't know they're being videotaped. So this is a montage of how kids are trying to handle it. And they're poking, they're prodding, they're trying to come up with strategies like ignore, or here's the identical twins looking like they're using similar strategies. And some of them succeed, and holding off. Some of them have a little tougher time. Most of them do touch it or pretend to eat it, even maybe pick at it a little bit. But the theme of this is that there is variability in self-control, the so-called self-control trait. And it may even be a trait that is fairly stable throughout life, although there's nothing that says self-control behaviors you show as a young person are fate, and that there surely is something that can be shaped, and people can be taught how to either improve or show less self-control. And context is going to play a role. Now, this girl didn't wait too long. She started eating even while given instructions. She perhaps didn't care about waiting around for the second reward. And here's at the end where the moderator comes in and congratulates the young boy for hanging in there, and he gets his reward of the second one. The so-called marshmallow test. There are people who've studied this and looked at how young people are doing with this task over the years, and there's some data to suggest actually kids are doing a better job with it than they have in the past. So maybe we're teaching better self-control with better parenting, and perhaps our education system is doing that. Okay, the SBIRT model. It has three main components: screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment, or referral to services, because often we're sending youngsters on for more services than formal treatment. I'm going to go through each of these components in some detail. But first, some resources. This slide has some free ones. I see maybe at the bottom we're missing the website. But the first three are free resources that cover drug abuse treatment in general. So they would have some chapters or sections that deal with SBIRT, but the fourth and the fifth are two resources specifically about SBIRT. And if you go to those websites, you'll see a lot of information ranging from the S all the way to the RT. For cost items, there are four I have here. The first two are generic. They are manuals about adolescent drug abuse and textbooks. Both of them are edited, and they'll have some SBIRT specific features, as well as a lot on co-occurring disorders and treatment approaches across the span of disorders. The third is a great book on motivational interviewing with adolescents. This is an edited book, but drills neatly into how to use this approach for youngsters. And then the fourth is a product from a group at Cognito. This is an interesting multi-component training module for how to learn SBIRT, and it includes avatar technology, so you can watch simulated examples and learn from that. It's a cost item, but I think just an excellent resource. I think of SBIRT as just very clinical friendly, and so I'm showing you a Swiss Army knife. The metaphor for me is SBIRT is like the Swiss Army knife. It's handy. You can use it in multiple settings, and it has a lot of different tools in it for a range of purposes. And so why might we like it as a model for teenagers? I think it has many teen-friendly features. In general, the SBIRT model is going to be done in what I'd call brief counseling, or in a very brief time frame. So there's a minimal commitment by the teenager. At least the BI component usually focuses on using motivational interviewing and cognitive behavior therapy strategies. And these approaches, which we'll get into in more detail, I think are very accommodating to when working with teenagers. A wide range of professionals can learn SBIRT, It is not heavy lifting technology, and it can be done in many different settings. I call them opportunistic settings, such as schools, school health clinics, pediatric clinics, juvenile detention centers, juvenile drug courts, etc. Another reason I like the model is that it fills the need for indicated prevention, and there aren't a lot of really evidence-based programs that fit that portion of the prevention continuum. A little bit more about indicated prevention. With the help of Tammy Chung, this figure tries to show you how we can categorize, somewhat simplistically, various levels of severity of substance use. And you can see that there's 6 categories, and they vary a little bit on how much they're based on substance use frequency as well as how many symptoms you might have from the DSM-5 diagnostic manual. But if you start at the bottom and then work your way up, you're seeing the least severe group all the way to the most severe. All right. So at the low and the top end, or at the 2 extremes, the 2 bookends, you actually are probably addressing or are thinking of teenagers that don't fit the sweet spot of the SBIRT model. So for teenagers that have no past year substance use or are infrequent substance users, they're not likely going to need any clinical services. They might benefit from prevention, but not clinical services. And estimates put roughly about 70% of teenagers, depending on age and many other variables, fit that definition. At the very severe end, roughly 5% might meet the substance use disorder severe level, which means they have several of the substance use disorder criteria. And for those individuals, they might need more than SBIRT, something more intensive. But we could think of a sweet spot somewhere in the middle that ranges from those that are starting to use regularly as well as those that are starting to show mild or moderate substance use disorder symptoms. And they seem to be the most appropriate as suitable. And they're probably early in their substance use. Admittedly, some of them may grow out of the problem, but to at least address the issues and see if the teenager can recognize that they might not be on a healthy pathway can make a lot of clinical sense. And surely it meets the public health need of helping teenagers negotiate the teenage adolescent years without adding extra risk by using drugs. Estimates put the size of this so-called sweet spot at roughly 25% of teenagers. A little bit more. SBIRT looks to be showing some early effectiveness. I point people to a very good meta-analysis by Tanner Smith and Lipsey in 2014. There are others out there as well, and they do a good job of providing an overview of what's already been studied, the rigor of those investigations, and to what extent we can say that we're looking at promising, emerging, or definitive effectiveness. The RT part of the model hasn't been studied much, though. It's an important component, but right now it looks like we're relying on clinical knowledge and not empirical findings. The model has been endorsed by many professional organizations. The most prominent would be the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's also getting recognized in the reimbursement world by having CPT codes associated with it and the opportunity for you to be reimbursed for your efforts. So next up, let's look at the 3 components with some detail. Start with screening. I want to distinguish screening from assessment, and one way to do that is to look at the depth of information and the type of decision made from a screening. So the notion is that a screening process, you're really just assessing the probabilistic nature if there is a problem or what problems exist or not. And thus the decision from that is either more assessment or, as many people now suggest, it can make sense to do a brief intervention. Because brief interventions do not force definitive goals and work with a teenager on negotiating behavior change. I agree with those that say even though you might not be sure if there's a definitive problem, it can make sense to talk to a teenager about their health behaviors. That's to be contrasted with assessment. So with a full assessment that often can take 2 to 3 hours or perhaps even longer, the depth of information is more definitive. You're nailing down if there's a diagnosis or diagnoses or not. And from there, the clinical decisions typically is should there be formal treatment or not. And if there is decision for treatment, you would probably start to make some determinations of what type or what setting too. There are a lot of tools available in the screening arena. I have listed 7 of them here. Some of them are cost items and some of them are public domain. Even the cost items, let's see which, the 4th one, the GAIN SS and the PESC and the SASSY adolescent, those 3 are cost items, but they're relatively inexpensive. But there are others, 4 of them up here that are not at cost and public domain. And all of these have been tested on adolescents. We've got a lot of psychometric rigor working with this population. Let me focus on 2 of them. Many of you have probably heard of the craft, but I also want to show you a little bit about the heads. This is the standard craft, the 6 items. Each item represents a letter from the acronym. Take a moment and just read those. I think if you think about the items, you hopefully come to the conclusion that they're basically face valid. There's nothing subtle about them. If a teenager wants to deny they have a problem, it'd be easy for them just to say no to all of those, even though they might have a problem. So it's not going to detect someone who's trying to fake good. But they work quite well. It's amazing how 6 items are very predictive. There's a question of, so what do you do with a cut score? Because you can get scores all the way from 0 to 6. 0 meaning you said no to all of them, and 6 meaning you said yes to all of them. And this is a recommended breakdown, but it's open for interpretation and adjustment. But if somebody says no to all of them, or maybe yes to just one, they might not need a formal brief intervention. Perhaps assessing later, or recommending that if they are using, that they pull back. But the brief intervention sweet spot is thought to be somewhere in the 2 to 5 range. If you get a 6, that might lead to several options. You could do a brief intervention because you might think of it as the first step in a step care approach, trying to open the door for the teenagers. Try something that's not a full commitment, and if it looks like they really do have a severe problem, you could convince perhaps the teenager to get more services later. Another option would be just do a formal and a full diagnostic workup and really get the details. We'll talk later about how it's likely a teenager with a severe form or severe level of substance use also has co-occurring problems. And if so, more assessment is needed for sure along those lines. And then I thought I would mention a little bit about the heads. HEADSS. Each letter stands for a key word. In the assessment, you can see how it's broken down across a range of life functioning areas relevant to teenagers, not just drugs. If you Google heads, you will see how you can download for free structured and semi-structured interviews that help you with these 6 categories. And so if you're interested in a little bit more than screening for just substance abuse, you have, I think, an interesting public domain option with some rigor behind it if you choose the heads. There are several strategies and techniques you can do to optimize getting a good quality self-report from a teenager. it's not just that the teenager might have a certain mindset that might be a barrier to good self-report, but there's things you can do, or there's setting considerations that can also help optimize that you get high quality information from a teenager. I've got a list here, and this is not an exhaustive list, and all of them have a lot of details behind them. But I wanted to show you this to remind you that there are things you can do, such as building good rapport, establishing confidentiality, reinforcing the benefits of good assessment, as well as choosing a standardized test. Some standardized tests have scales to measure invalid responding that can help you then detect whether you think you're getting a good report or not. You surely could repeat testing. You might not think that you're getting a good accurate reading, and you could repeat it sometime later. Urine tests can be of value on some level. You got to keep in mind, if you're going to go down that road, the tests often have short time detection windows for various drugs, and it only tells you if the person has that substance in their system for that time window, and it doesn't tell you anything else about severity or problems resulting from use. So it has limited value, but in some settings it can be important to back up self-report with a biometric reading. The core of SBIRT is brief intervention, so we'll spend a lot of time on this. Good news is there's several available brief interventions that are manualized and in the literature and meet the definition of evidence-based. The five that I have found in the literature are these, with the first one focused on college students. And then there's the brief strategic family therapy, MET CBT5, the brief negotiated interview, and teen intervene. For the sake of time, I'm going to just briefly highlight these three. And so for each of these, I have websites that you can go to, and I have more information about all of them if you're interested. So MET CBT combines, I think, the two wonderful components that are key elements to effective counseling with teenagers: motivational interviewing and cognitive behavior therapy. The MET part blends motivational interviewing with normative assessment feedback. That's where the client and you as a counselor go through a procedure where you evaluate or get a reading of the teenager's view of their use and how normal it is, and then you compare their perception to what are norms for that youngster, and you see if you can get the teenager to gain some insight, because the likelihood is teenagers think that the heavy or high-end use that they're engaged in is normal, and they're surprised when they see that perhaps is not the case. And these sessions also use a lot of good CBT strategies, and these include wonderful approaches to convince a teenager to solve specific problems, so it's personalized at that level. And also it works on the theme that you've got to have goals that are practical, that can have immediate feedback to the teenager, and that are meaningful to him or her. So there's a negotiation process that goes on with that. So you make sure that you're addressing something that's relevant to the youngster. The brief negotiated interview is a single session, 60-minute format. It's organized around these 4 structured steps. The first 2 are really organized around this personal feedback approach, but you have to start that by engaging the youngster as to what their view is about risk of substance use and what their use levels are. Then you compare that to what might be considered a normative and what might be considered harmful or non-harmful. And of course, the idea there is to have the teenager gain some insight that they may be overusing and engaging in more harmful behavior than they think they are. Then there's the use of the decisional balance exercise and a readiness ruler to help improve motivation. We'll delve into that in a few minutes. And then the last step is where you negotiate a plan for change. And these changes are an effort to get the person either for harm or risk reduction or abstinence. And the idea is to encourage them to be the captain of their change, and that the change has to come from within, and that you as the counselor is not the one that's going to affect the change, but he or she, the youngster, has to be responsible for it. Often these plans for change can address co-occurring problems as well, particularly when you've been able to link what might be an underlying issue in the teenager's life, behavioral or emotional, for example, that might be driving the drug use. And that information comes from the decisional balance exercise. So steps 3 and 4 are also quite useful, because what you learn in step 3 with the decisional balance tool, you can use to help shape a relevant plan for change. Soon we'll get into that a little bit more. The last one I wanted to emphasize is the Teen Intervene program. This has 3 sessions, so it's a little bit more than a brief negotiated plan, but it's also a little bit less than the 5-session MET CBT. 2 of the sessions are focused just with the teenager, and then there's a 3rd session that's just with the parent. The role of the parent session is to help and support the teenager's goals. And this has the full SBIRT model in its revised form. It included the craft as a screening tool, and it has a guide for the counselor for the referral to treatment component. Okay, these evidence-based brief intervention programs have some common elements. I have 4 that I'm going to just briefly summarize. Decisional balance exercise, to me, is the most effective component of any brief intervention. If you just had 5 or 10 minutes with somebody and wanted to try to get them to look at their drug use habit in a little different light, and maybe even then use that information to leverage a plan of action for him or her in a very brief amount of time, I would just do a decisional balance interview with him or her. Here's examples of how this is done. I've got the 2 basic halves of decisional balance exercise, the pros and the cons, and sample questions and inquiries within each. You always start with the pros, and then you follow with the cons. The pros are important because they help you get a ballpark read of the functional value that may be driving the individual's drug use. For teenagers, I think it's the research tells us that social recreational value, social benefits, and coping strategies or psychological benefits are the 3 driving pathways that are the functional motives underlying adolescent drug use. Of course, they can vary among teenagers. Some teenagers, it's all of those. For some, you find a dominance of the psychological benefits, and that often is for those that have an underlying depression or anxiety problem. For teenagers with the cons, you might not be getting much. That's okay. Given what it's like for a teenager these days, and the fact they might not have been using that much, and they might have been clever enough not to have been caught, or maybe they have been caught and there's consequences and they don't care, so they might not be admitting to much. But that's all right. You're usually going to get some great information on the pros side, and you can use that when you're setting up goals. Motivational interviewing is a second common element. You may know about the value of this strategy as an effort to move a client's attitude about change from the low-level pre-contemplation, where the individual isn't thinking about change, all the way to preparation and action, where then you're you have a client ready to change, and your goal is to help him or her towards those changes. So in pre-contemplation, you're raising doubt, increasing the client's perception of risk. If you can move or have them in contemplation, you want the teenager then to start to talk about the value of their thinking of change and how they can improve their life and make some important health improvements by agreeing to some changes. And when they're in preparation and action, you're really getting specific with a teenager about where they're going to go with their changes. The notion is that if you can move a client even one stage to the right, you've doubled the chance that the individual will eventually get to action within a short amount of time. So you are going to get a lot of clients in pre-contemplation, and just if you can shift that person's attitudes towards contemplation, you're making some good progress. This is my facetious slide about the stage of progression for teenagers. I'm just showing this because in many ways, you may not move a teenager all that far out of pre-contemplation, even if you can nudge him or her theoretically into once in a while thinking about change, you might have made some decent progress. That's why you don't want to get too frustrated when you're doing brief counseling with a teenager, because you don't have a lot of time to work with him or her, and you might not be thinking you really don't have much commitment from the youngster. That's all right. Hopefully you're planting mustard seeds. Motivational interviewing works, I think, on two levels. One, it helps promote this client-centered approach as opposed to therapist-centered, which means you're de-emphasizing labels, you're emphasizing personal choice. You're focusing on getting the client's concerns. You're acting as a mentor and a coach with those concerns in helping him or her set goals. You might have some important goals in mind. You may want to nudge your client towards those goals, but the notion is that you really got to get buy-in from the teenager and not overforce how you may see goals. Here's some sample sound bites from a good motivational sentence. I can see why you see many benefits of using. That's recognizing in the pros. Describe a time when you were with your friends and you did not use, or you used less than you had planned to. That's a good statement, because maybe you're going to get some examples and you can use that as leverage, see if the teenager can find value in repeating that. The last one, okay, it looks like we do not agree on this topic. Let's move on. Many times you have to roll with the resistance you're receiving and agree to disagree at that point, and you can always come back to an issue later. The second key to effective motivation interviewing is that you're eliciting change talk. I've got some examples of what might be the kind of thing you're trying to get from a client by asking questions that plant mustard seeds of change. And so it's just saying things like, what personal strengths do you have that will help you succeed? What encourages you that you can change if you want to? So you might not be getting a client interested in change, but if you can just get them to talk about the possibility of change, the potential that they can change, that's still moving the behavior change ball forward. Third element is cognitive behavior therapy. As you may know, this approach is used in a range of treatment strategies to address all kinds of behavioral and emotional problems in adolescents and adults. So the notion is you focus on immediate and relevant and specific problems, and you design the treatment plan and the goals around things that are realistic and action-oriented. You're changing either the person's way of thinking about something, their behavior, or both. And then the final is negotiating goals. There's a range of things. You might not get a teenager who's interested in any drug use related goals. Maybe they don't want to change their substance use patterns. They may not be interested in any harm or risk reduction. That's fine. I think the one idea is to get them to agree to some goal. Now that could be just to get them to think and learn more about their triggers. So everyone has some either internal or external triggers for their drug use. And just getting them to gain some insight about that and to monitor that can be of value. Some counselors use the brief intervention and realize I don't have a teenager at all interested in changing their substance use, but they have expressed other kinds of problems in their life. And so I'll jump on that and see if I can get some progress along those lines. So they might have an issue with their friends, with school, with their parents, issues with anxiety, depression, etc. And building some goals around that can get them started, can get them to feel like you're credible and that the counseling process is favorable and rewarding, and maybe you can work in drug use goals later. I'm also a big fan of having youngsters just focus on what their personal assets are and encouraging them to build those and focus more on them and do more things to promote those assets as a goal. So this slide is a reminder that it's not common for most brief interventions to focus on the parent, but if you do find that you have an opportunity for that, one way to look at the kinds of things you want to do with a parent is to improve both their discipline or monitoring behaviors and their support behaviors. So teenagers that have parents that are on top of those teenagers' lives, have rules and expectations, and do a good job of monitoring if the teenager's meeting those expectations, you find that those are parents that are quite good at the so-called disciplining and monitoring skills. And the support component is just as important, and that's where the parents are providing emotional and environmental support to the youngster, where many instances a teenager will say, I can at least turn to one parent to share or talk about a personal problem. And parents that are good with supportive behaviors find that teenagers agree to that. The last component is referral to treatment or services. It's the least studied, as I mentioned. People have applied their clinical common sense to this portion of the model. Usually this is met with several barriers: what services are available if more services are needed, and what kind of things might get in the way of my teenager or the teenager's family from seeking those services, including, is there insurance coverage for stepped up services? Is there anyone with expertise that's local that I'm hoping he or she can be referred to, etc. So it's a very challenging situation. Some use the RT component to add sessions. And so they might actually decide to conduct booster sessions. And so with your own skill, you could perhaps provide these extra services, more assessment, or dealing with the additional problems. This is a model that we've shown others where you can figure out what kind of outcome you're getting with your brief intervention, and then that can lead you to perhaps some suggestions of where you want to go with the referral to treatment. So favorable outcome, you support the continued favorable behavior, all the way from the minimal change needing some booster down to you may have a problem that's worsening, or you've realized with the screening you have multiple problems and you need to refer for more assessment. Would you like to be part of an SBIRT research project? I'm been made available this interesting project funded by a grant with the Conrad Hilton Foundation called Project AMP. Now this is a 4-session brief intervention designed to reduce and prevent substance use in adolescents who are at risk. So it's the indicated prevention model. The delivery of it is by young adult peers who are in recovery and that are trained then to deliver the brief intervention. The study officials are hoping to see how this works in school sites. And they're in a phase 2 portion of the project, which means they've already designed Project AMP and done an initial pilot study and found it reasonable and favorable early results. And so now want to implement a a rigorous, full-fledged investigation. If you're interested, there's the contact site at the bottom, Project AMP. So I have a 5-minute sidebar topic, and then we have plenty of time for Q&A. A major limitation of SBIRT is represented by this slide. As I've mentioned a little bit, and as you are well aware of if you work with teenagers, usually substance use does not occur in a vacuum. And multiple other problems typically occur in teenagers who have a substance use problem, even those that have a mild problem. This is a noisy slide, but I put a red box around the 2 bars that are of interest to our discussion. They represent 2 groups that are labeled mild and moderate, and you can see below it how many symptoms are present. And the colors of the inside these 2 columns represent how many other or co-occurring problems are present in individuals within these 2 groups. And the lighter colors mean either none or a few problems, and the darker colors mean a lot of problems. You can see that even with youngsters who are showing mild or moderate substance use disorder levels, which range from 2 to 5 symptoms, they show several other problems. You can see in contrast what the no substance use disorder group looks like as well to the far right, the severe. But the point is there's, pretty common to have 2, 3, 4, even 5 co-occurring problems, even when you're at the mild, moderate level. So one notion is that perhaps downstream we're going to look at SBIRT as a great first step, but for individuals and settings that have the ability to expand it and be a bit more ambitious, they might be able to enhance it. And I think you could enhance it on 2 levels. One would be at the screening and at the brief intervention level. So this slide represents my thinking along these lines. The screening enhancement would mean you find a multi-problem screening tool that does more than just screen for drug abuse. And hopefully you could use a screen that might have ability to screen for the most common co-occurring problems among teenagers. So there are a lot of problems. You could make a list 20 to 30, 40, 50. But I think it's rational to talk about a core set that are somewhere in the 5 to 10 range that I would call common co-occurring problems. Not all of them are diagnosable level problems, but some of them are important problems. We call them subclinical, but still important. And then the notion behind the brief intervention is that it wouldn't just focus on the drug use, but you would additionally focus on what might be the biggest co-occurring or the most salient co-occurring problem. So if you've screened for several, you might prioritize and figure out, okay, I'm going to do 2 or 3 more sessions, and I'm going to prioritize this list of screening issues, this list of co-occurring problems, and I will take some time and address each of them with some evidence-based cognitive behavior therapy approaches. And then the RT part would be where you have to figure out after you do the full model, this enhanced model, what would be the next steps? Like with the regular SBIRT, if I got improvement, do I do a booster, or do I really see there's significant other problems and I want to intensify specialized treatment to address those problems? So I'm not sure where this will go. I offer just as a look into the future. There isn't anything formally in the literature along these lines. There's people writing about it. I know there's people applying for grants to see if they can develop and test this model. But you can see there's several challenges. There are multi-problem screening tools. But it means you have to spend more time. It's more than just 2 or 3 minutes. It might take 10 or 15. You got to have a little bit more sophisticated scoring staff in mind. And some of them are not public domain, but multi-screening tools do exist. And one could put together a personalized brief intervention package by taking modules that already address anxiety or depression, delinquency. They exist, and you could package those and use the ones that make the most sense for a teenager. So I'm going to summarize. I think the SBIRT approach is emerging, but a very promising set of tools that can help address a wider range of adolescents with early or mild, moderate drug use problems than we're already doing with our existing strategies, which tend to be too intensive. So it doesn't make sense to offer intensive inpatient or outpatient therapy or a 12-step approach to a teenager with a mild, moderate problem. And the SBIRT approach, though, is a rational clinical strategy or toolbox to apply in such situations. The field is starting to show evidence-based and evidence-informed programs and models. And I spent a little time just talking about perhaps the future will expand this, where we can formalize a way to screen for multiple problems that typically exist in teenagers and provide tools for counselors that can help address those multiple problems. Well, thank you for this opportunity. I see we've got 10 minutes, and we surely can use that time if people have some questions.
Okay. So before we do questions, just a quick reminder that you'll be getting the slides in about an hour and also a survey asking you about the webinar. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. And if not, I have a couple to get us started with. So Ken, are there settings in which the SBIRT model works best for adolescents, or settings in which it might work the worst?
The conversations that I've had with a wide range of professionals along these lines is that the biggest barrier is a setting that doesn't have the time to really at least do a 1-hour brief intervention. I know there are examples of the 5 to 10 minute conversation, but I'm not optimistic that those are going to work at a very favorable level.
Mm-hmm.
Even though if you only had 5 or 10 minutes, like I said earlier, I think the decisional balance exercise would be it. So that's why I'm more encouraged that school health clinics, the juvenile detention centers, juvenile drug courts, and outpatient counseling programs and settings all could find, I think, a home for the SBIRT model. Pediatric clinics and general healthcare settings, they're more challenged because they often have a difficult time allocating time and resources and staff to something that's, I'd call it the lengthier version of an SBIRT.
Interesting. How much training is needed to implement SBIRT?
So I don't think a lot of training is needed. This will vary on your background and your skill in working with young people. A counselor who is good with teenagers probably has a lot of skill in talking to young people in general. And that might be more important than how much classroom training you've received. So there's a lot of great youth-serving professionals that don't have formal training, but are just outstanding with young people.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, there's a lot of training you can get online for either very low cost or for free.
Great. Wow, that's great. Another question from the group is, should the teen and parent do family sessions on top of the teen receiving their own services?
Yes, if that would be ideal. And the brief family therapy program that was in one of those slides, that is the basic model. That requires more training. It can be more complicated. There's a lot of things you got to watch out for. You've got to be careful of all the different perspectives, and it can really be a challenge to meet the teenager's needs, but not also turn off the parent. And then you got the other side where you're trying to meet the parent's needs and you're perhaps creating a barrier with the teenager. My view of that expanded SBIRT could be one of the modules. So you might realize with your screening that it's really a family systems problem. And one of the modules might be then, okay, we're going to actually have, a couple sessions that's a form of family therapy.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. How successful is this model for teens with addiction problems? Can you talk a little bit more about the evidence for the effectiveness of SBIRT?
So unfortunately, most of the literature doesn't go out more than 6 months or 1 year outcome. It's reasonable when you look at the 1 year and 6 month outcome data. Yeah, in part because I think you're getting nice results, even though they were very non-intensive approaches. One of the things we found when we studied is that we had a slight advantage when the parent was involved for more access to community services after the brief intervention. And so keep in mind, an SBIRT model might be just moving the momentum forward a bit for the teenager and or the family to seek more services. So you might be at the front end providing a little push, and downstream there might be additional help, and the more significant outcomes will unfold. And so we did find a little bit of that when we compared just a version of the brief intervention that was just the teenage sessions only versus the teenage sessions with that third parent. So the third parent, while it probably didn't change parenting practices much, what are you going to do in one session? But it looked like it acted to alert the parent that maybe that we should take this and these issues more seriously, and let's take advantage of some local resources for additional help.
Interesting. Did anyone else have any other questions? Doesn't look like it. Do you have any last advice you want to offer the listeners on how maybe they could get started with SBIRT, Dr. Winters?
Oh, well, definitely go to the slide that has the websites for free resources, the Children's Hospital and the IRETA group.
Great.
Both of them have websites with a lot of free tools.
Great. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for attending today. Have a good rest of the week.
You too. Thank you, Dr. Winters.